Hi, this is Paul, and it's the beginning of May, which means that the Christian Reformed Synod is right around the corner. This is the time of year that a lot of denominations have their annual meetings, and a lot of things get solved or resolved or broken or fixed. Some of the larger mainline denominations, like the United Methodists, they've been in the news. I usually cover a bunch of things in the Christian Reformed Church, and for some strange reason, a whole bunch of you like to follow along. On the Christian Reformed Church website, if you want to play along at home, there's crcna.org/synod resources, which will bring you to a page of synod resources, including acts and agendas. On the website, they go back to 1999, but then you can hit a link and go to the Calvin Library, and they have scanned agendas going way back. I didn't notice that until now. That's a really helpful resource. So, boy, if I had time, I could have a whole lot of fun with just nerding out over CRC church history and going back and reading these agendas and acts of synod. This is super cool. Anyway, there are a bunch of things in the current agenda that I'm going to want to highlight. I won't highlight them all in this video. There may be subsequent videos where I highlight other things. I might break it up into different videos by topic. These videos tend to get different views. Some people watch them who normally watch my channel. Other people in the Christian Reformed Church watch them because they're interested in things in the Christian Reformed Church. And there's not a whole lot on YouTube for people in the Christian Reformed Church. So here's the PDF of the agenda for Synod 2024. As a general rule in the Christian Reformed Church, it's assemblies. Christian Reformed Church have 3 levels of assemblies: the local church council, the classis, and the denomination. And as a rule, their proceedings are open to the public. So you can look at the agenda, you can read through the agenda. We'll talk about what the agenda is. I talked in the Should Synod Go Dark about a lot of this is presentational. Now, this book is 614 pages, so it is not for the faint of heart. And it reads, if you've got difficulty sleeping, some portions of this book will definitely put you to sleep. And it has a few rules and introductions. It has the schedule. Part of what's going to happen this year is that, similar to 2022, the first synod after COVID, they are going to start with some virtual meetings. I expect they will very quickly elect officers at those virtual meetings. If you remember Synod 2023, it ended with something of a debacle. And so they are going to make sure that they can complete the entire agenda during the time specified. And so they'll have virtual meetings Wednesday, May 29. I'm curious as to how this will go. I suspect, as in 2022, they did them in 2022. They didn't do them in 2023. Now they're doing them again in 2024, and they will probably be on Zoom. And I suspect, as in 2022, they will probably post recordings of them on the denominational YouTube page, so that they can continue to operate in the spirit of open to the public unless there's something that requires executive session, and then the cameras go off. Generally speaking, things that require executive session have to do with confidentiality, usually involving a particular individual. All of the stuff that's open on the internet should be policy-wise, and therefore open discussion for members of the Christian Reformed Church and the rest of the public may view along. So Wednesday, May 29, coming up at the end of the month, 7 to 10:30 p.m., I assume that's Eastern time, will be the virtual convening session. Wednesday, June 5, virtual advisory committee meetings. Now, as I've mentioned in many previous videos, Synod is not just the plenary sessions. Those are the ones that are usually recorded, and you can see them on YouTube. You can go on YouTube back a number of years and watch them a number of years. But that is only half of Synod. The first part of Synod are advisory committee meetings. The way Synod works is that all of the stuff in this agenda and supplementary materials go to the advisory committees, and there will be a bunch of them. there is I don't doubt it's up on the website. There is a program committee that, no, the program committee report isn't usually public. So there's a program committee report that takes all of the delegates and then assigns them certain denominational officials as assistants, takes all of those delegates and puts them into a certain number of committees, like 10, 12, 13 or so. And some of them are sort of standing committees. They sort of committee 1, committee 2, committee 3. They tend to have the same mission each year. And then they add committees to deal with other issues that come into Synod. And in those advisory committees, those are not televised or recorded. They are in a certain way sort of executive session. They're not open to the public. There's no gallery for them. But in many ways, that's where the real work of Synod gets done, because the vast majority of things sort of get ironed out and bargained out in committee, and then they come as recommendations to the full floor. Now, the goal of each advisory committee is to leave the advisory committee with one report, with a unified report. And so the whole committee gets on the same page, does a little bit of negotiating and comes to Synod with one recommendation on a particular thing. If the committee cannot come to agreement on its recommendation, then you get a minority and a minority report. And in the last few years, we've seen several of these, and it's usually around a contentious issue. And then the majority report has preference, and the minority report can only be brought to the floor if the majority report gets tabled. And so then usually you watch the proceedings to see, okay, will this thing be tabled? If it gets tabled, then the minority report comes through, and they deal with it then. All of that we will see, Lord willing, in June, when Synod actually comes to the floor. And last year, during Synod 2023, I was in Santa Cruz for the graduation of my youngest son from college. And so I had to just sort of grab Synod haphazard. I will be here at Living Stones, working my normal schedule during Synod, so I will be able to keep an eye on it, and I will probably make videos as Synod is conducting its business and beforehand. So there's the schedule for Synod. That's early in the report. And the schedule is pretty much a template. If you go back over previous Synods, you'll see, for the most part, they follow the same thing. And Synod will adjourn no later than 3:30 p.m. on Tuesday. Now, a lot of people say, well, Synod shouldn't have a hard stop at that point. The difficulty is that many Synod delegates fly in, and so they have airline tickets for later that day on Thursday. Some will stay over till Friday, but many leave. And many of them are ministers who are in fact having to preach that coming Sunday. And so they kind of want to get back and rush and put together a sermon and care for their churches. That's usually the way it goes. Now, this next section I want to pay attention to, because there's something very important to notice here in terms of, I would say, the vitality and ownership of the Christian Reformed Church. So here's Synod 1999. Again, starts out with similar text. This is all sort of David Egelhard. He was my Old Testament teacher back in seminary in the 80s. He was the general secretary then. Announcements, notes to delegates, and in fact, a lot of this stuff that's the same every year in the book. And then you have the delegates to Synod. Now, this is 1999, so this is basically 25 years ago. What you will notice, if you notice the difference between, I continue to recognize names there, Bruce Personaire. This is my classis. I was 99, I was already in classis. Bruce Personaire, John Behrens, David Verwer, Scott Camper, Calvin Friend, former roommate of mine at Calvin, George Vink. One of the interesting changes that you will notice is in Synod 2024, all of these lines. Now, I went through and counted, and of the 49 classes delegating to Synod, only 14 of them have full slates. What do I mean by a full slate? Synod classes are supposed to delegate a minister, an elder, and a deacon, and then another person who is either a minister, commissioned pastor, an elder, or a deacon. These are supposed, and then there are alternates for each position. And most people who are the primary delegates go to Synod, but things come up, and every year someone can't go, and so the alternate has to step in and go. In 1999, I wrote this up, hang on. In 1999, only 15 classes didn't have full slates, and many of those that didn't have full slates were only missing one or two. And this was when classes were only sending ministers and elder delegates. In other words, they didn't have deacons to draw from. Now, what that suggests to me is, number one, there is a lot less desire to go to Synod. And I also suspect that with the declining numeric participation and aging of the denomination, that churches have been downsizing their local councils. Back in the 70s and before then, I don't remember, was it in the 80s or 90s? I think it was in the 90s. In the 80s or 90s, they went from a 2-week synod to a 1-week synod. And so when my father would go back in the day, they would be in synod for 2 weeks. And so it's a significant drop. It's a significant change that there's not enough. Well, what is it? Ownership? Is it motivation? What is it that classes either don't or can't get enough people to actually participate in Synod? And also bear in mind, in 1999, only men could be delegated to Synod. In 2024, not only do you have deacons, but you have women available to be delegated to Synod. And so it's really a significant change. Now, the place I usually go to discuss Synod news is CRC Voices. And it's a place that I go to sort of process news with other people that I know in the denomination. And then I wrote a little piece. Classes generally have some way of selection, often a vote, and those who don't make the cut to be delegates become alternates. That's the way it works in my classes, and my classes was able to field a full delegation this time. Keep in mind, Synod 2024 has ministers of the word, commissioned pastors, elders, deacons, men and women. 1999 only had elders and only had ministers and elders and only men. The real crisis in the CRC is to field enough leaders. I suspect that an analysis of council size would reveal that the number of office bearers in the CRC has declined precipitously. Now, a really helpful report in this Acts of Synod is the Candidacy Report. This is the Candidacy Report's report. Synod 2004 established the concept of Synodical Ministerial Candidacy Committee, which is now known as the Candidacy Committee. The committee began meeting in late 2004 and has provided a full-time staff person in late 2007. The committee mandate is available on a document titled Journey Towards Ordination, accessible on the Candidacy Committee website, crc.org/candidacy. And this is actually one of the most important committees in the denomination. This committee has been helping. This committee came about because traditionally young men would graduate from college, Calvin College or maybe Dort or another college, and then they would go to Calvin Seminary, and then from Calvin Seminary they would become candidates for ministers, and then they would become ministers. What began to happen in the 80s and 90s was that more and more Christian Reformed people who were interested in candidacy were going to other seminaries. And there was, for a long time, a path by which if you got a Master's of Divinity from another seminary, you could then become a minister in the Christian Reformed Church. If you took some classes at Calvin Seminary, filled some requirements, did some examinations, and then you could go into the system. But by and large, almost anyone who became a minister in the Christian Reformed Church went through Calvin Seminary. There was a report, Alternate Paths of Ministry, that opened it up so that other people would go in. The pathway is still the same, but then someone needed to sort of govern this. Another big change happened when the denomination created the office of evangelist, which then became ministry associate, which then became commissioned pastors. And these are people that are not ordained at the denominational level, they are ordained at the classical level. And an MDiv is not required for that. In certain situations, they can do all of the tasks that a minister of the word can do, but they can only do it at a local or regional level, depending on the stipulations of that classis. And the Candidacy Committee was there to make sure that all of the requirements for these examinations and all of those stipulations would be monitored. And so the Candidacy Committee is a very active committee in the Christian Reformed Church. And then the names of the members of the committee are there. And then they actually tackle some really important things that are going on denominationally right now. In fall of 2023, the Candidacy Committee set out to gain a clear perspective on the current leadership landscape in the Christian Reformed Church of North America by surveying a broad representation of classis leaders to learn about their experiences with pastoral vacancies, leadership development, facilitation of the candidacy pathways. Since leadership development is an integral factor in sustaining membership growth, we believe that an effort to understand the current trends and issues and development strategies for improvement will support 2023's directives to the CRC&A agencies to work towards the development of a comprehensive unified strategy and plan to arrest and reverse the trend of decline and bring about a positive trend of membership growth in our denomination. There's a jargon that develops in pretty much every field of focus. And one of the interesting things, if you would read back over agendas for Synod in previous years, you would note the jargon of those cultures. Now, I'm thinking about making a video pertaining directly to the CRC that deals with the Edith Bunker video, a culture of sincerity, a culture of authenticity, and a culture of prophilicity. Now, I should remind you of this video from last year. The top video there entitled CRC&A Synod 2023, Reverend Vander Goes to Synod and How God Loves His Little Flock. Scott Vander is a pastor in Fort St. Lucie, Florida, and he took sort of a struggling small church and turned it into a mega church with a discipleship program. And no one in the denomination has been more determined than him to get the denomination to actually address its membership decline that has been steady since the 1990s. And now with this current fight, might sort of push the CRC over the edge. I'll put a link below to that video. Because in that video, I basically showed how through sheer force and determination, he was basically told no by the advisory committee. He was told no by the Synod floor. And one way or another, he would not take no for an answer. And so basically, he got Synod to say yes. Now, of course, getting Synod to say yes is one thing. Getting Synod to say yes and have it work through all the machinery of the Christian Reformed Church to actually achieve the outcomes that he was looking for, that's a whole nother thing. But the Candidacy Committee at least is aware here that there will be no change in the direction, the numerical direction of the Christian Reformed Church without not only more leaders, but better leaders. And that, of course, is the mandate for the Candidacy Committee. We hope that the data compiled through this survey can fuel conversations. Hey, here we are. And inform strategies to move denomination towards desired positive growth trend. The Candidacy Committee has begun processing the insights gleaned through the survey In conversation with our partners in leadership development, Calvin Theological Seminary, we intend to continue discussing, evaluating, and strategizing topics for the survey of Classis Ministerial Leadership Team, CMLT leaders. Our classis, many classes have a CMLT, and so the Denominational Candidacy Committee works with the Classical Committee to help basically those who express interest in ordination in the Christian Reformed Church kind of form a learning plan among them. Will you go to a seminary? Do you need financial help going to a seminary? Our classis spends a significant amount of money making sure that no one who wants to go to a seminary in the Christian Reformed Church for ministry, future ministry in the Christian Reformed Church, won't be able to, that finances won't be in the way. Okay. The survey went to all classical ministerial leadership team members, stated clerks, synodical deputies, alternates, regional pastors, classical counselors, church visitors. 82 leaders responded, representing 39 of the 49 classes. That's pretty good. And then detailed some of that. And these are the results of their surveys. Many have inquired about the current ratio of vacant churches to ministers eligible for a call. And there's a growing sense the Christian Reformed Church has a pastor shortage. We discovered that our Candidacy Committee database could not provide sufficient or accurate data to determine that ratio. And this is true of a lot of things. Even though, as I often say, there's a lot of data collected and processed about churches in general, but it's actually pretty difficult to gain accurate data even within a specific denomination. Pastors are busy. Usually they become sort of bottlenecks for getting information. As churches decline, usually a lot of things are just left to the pastor, and because a lot of things are left to the pastor, a lot of things don't get done. So in order to arrive at a more accurate figure, the survey asked respondents to report how many vacancies they are aware of in their classis. A vacant church was defined as a church with no ordained pastor, neither minister of the word nor commissioned pastor, serving in a solo or senior role. The 38 classes represented in the survey reported 94 to 102 vacant churches. The variance in the reported numbers are due to a variance in the numbers reported by multiple respondents within the same classis. In addition, there are 34 vacancies currently listed in the database for classes that didn't respond to the survey. Based on these figures, we have determined that approximately 128 to 154 CRC churches are vacant at the time of this report. That's of about 1,000 churches. So let's say probably 15% of Christian Reformed churches have no solo or senior pastor. The number of ministers available for a call at the time of the survey was 86. This includes 10 new candidates, 12 extended candidates, and 64 ministers who are currently between calls. Now, it's sort of nice to look at these things as widgets, but they are not indeed widgets. Many ministers available for a call have been Article 17. Well, what does that mean? I might make a video about that because they're currently looking at those articles. That means that they were separated. They had a separation from their calling church. And in many cases, these are unhappy separations that the calling church and the minister didn't see eye to eye, and so they chose to go separate ways. In some cases, either the minister is performing in a marginal way, or perhaps the church is performing in a marginal or in a marginal way, and so there's a difference of opinion and they break up. Sometimes those churches will never call a new pastor. Sometimes these pastors will never receive another call. They basically have 2 years to receive a call, and that can be extended with permission from their classis and synodical deputies. A significant number, 12 to 15% of CRC churches are vacant, and it is likely that at least 1/3 of these vacant churches will have difficulty filling those positions with eligible ministers. Many of these churches are probably hitting viability issues, which means they might not have enough money to pay a full-time minister. What often happens in such a case is they sort of look around for someone who's maybe in the area, maybe a retired guy, maybe a guy with a little bit of seminary experience, someone who enjoys preaching a little bit, and they get usually a hymn to preach, but they don't have money for a full-time minister. and full-time ministers are getting more and more expensive all the time. There's another area in this agenda where they talk about ministerial compensation, and they're adjusting the language for it. Further, survey response report that about 40% of the churches currently searching for a pastor have been searching for more than 2 years. So that could be that for one reason or another, this church isn't desirable enough to attract a pastor. Maybe they can't actually pay a pastor, or maybe there are certain things in the church that a lot of potential ministers look at and say, I probably shouldn't go to that church. The reason for these vacancies as perceived by the respondents included the following: 19 reported small size of church or limited resources as a contributing factor. There's money. 23 reported due to the location of the church, either rural context or an area where the cost of living is high. So for example, if your church is in the Bay Area, you'd better have a parsonage, because nobody leaving seminary is going to buy a house in San Jose. It is simply not going to happen. And if you do have a parsonage, even then your cost of living is going to be high, and then suddenly ministerial salaries come to be an issue. Also, career track of the spouse. Many people, they might study for seminary, let's say in Grand Rapids, and then after seminary they're eligible for a call, but their spouse is already working, let's say, a career track in Grand Rapids, so they say, I'm eligible for a call within a certain number of miles of my home. And while there are a lot of churches in Western Michigan and Grand Rapids, those churches also tend to be highly desirable pulpits because a lot of people have family in the area and for other reasons. Many Christian Reformed church ministers would like to move to Grand Rapids and stay in Grand Rapids, and so not a lot of vacancies come up in the Grand Rapids area, while there are many vacancies around the U.S. and Canada in rural areas or high cost of living areas. 9 reported a lack of quality, quantity, or willingness of candidates to serve. 5 reported challenging dynamics within the congregation. 3 reported difficulty in finding a good fit, and 2 mentioned a need for a bivocational pastor to serve. Thrive consultant Shan Baker has also offered insights regarding the reasons for vacancies. Shan was on a video that I did with some other Christian Reformed ministers who were talking about the Human Sexuality Report and the decisions of Synod 2022. Boomer retirement. Many pastors, especially first-generation ethnic minorities, have been putting off retirement as long as possible, hoping to find a replacement. But those replacements are not forthcoming, and delaying further is proving impossible. Over the last 50 years, the Christian Reformed Church has been trying to diversify, and what that would mean would be Black, Hispanic, Asian pastors and churches come into the denomination. They're often looking for someone who can both fit the Christian Reformed Church ministry requirements and be a cultural fit for that congregation, especially if it's Korea. They need to be a Korean pastor and be fluent in Korean. Because many Korean churches are still ministering in the Korean language. So there's a lot of that going on. Pastors are less likely to leave their church. That is a real thing. I've been in this church 27 years. Al Scott, a colleague of mine down in Merced, has been in his church longer. Larry Freiling, I'm naming names on the internet. Larry Freiling retired in the Bay Area. He was here longer than me in classes. I'm just naming pastors who were here when I got here to classes these years ago. Kevin Adams, who's been on the channel, got here before me. But that's it. Many of us stay in a church a long time. If we like the church, if the church likes us, there's a lot of pressure not to move. And if, in a case like mine, the church gets small, my wife now in her job as a school teacher makes more money than I do. We depend on her job for my health insurance. Her job and pension are increasingly a big part of my retirement plan because her pension is quite a bit larger than mine. when it comes to retirement, and her pension comes with health insurance. So it's a big deal for a lot of pastors. Again, when I was growing up in the 60s and 70s, generally speaking, many ministerial families lived on the income from the church for the man ministering in the family, and the wife might volunteer in church, might have a little part-time job, maybe she taught in Christian school, but many of them stayed home. Part of what happened in the 80s and 90s and aughts, when cost of living kept going up and income hasn't kept pace with it, and churches start to come into decline, minister salaries start to go into decline relative to cost of living, many of these things. There was a big push in the 90s and aughts. A lot of ministers recognized that if they stayed living in parsonages, when they retired, they didn't have a place to retire into. And age 65, 66, or 67 isn't the best age to look for a mortgage. When my grandparents retired, they basically lived in condos in the Grand Rapids area, which in the day were relatively inexpensive. My parents, a few years before my father retired, my mother started working so they could save money, so they could eventually buy a condo, which my mother is living in, and so they didn't have to carry a mortgage into retirement. But many Christian Reformed ministers are looking at that and saying, how's this going to work? And so there's not a lot of people moving around between churches. Pastors today are much more likely than in generations past to own their own homes and to have a spouse who is working. Pastors are also much more likely to prioritize the needs of their families, both aging parents and children, than in generations past. This, again, is a factor why many want to settle in Western Michigan, because everything's there. All of these factors, which I think were mostly said to be good developments, that's what the report says, are sands in the gears of our pastor circulatory system. A pastor from Iowa is less willing to move to Alberta than would be 30 years ago. They want to stay in Iowa, just as a pastor from Alberta wants to stay in Alberta. That's a problem for any region of the U.S. and Canada not producing a steady stream of homegrown leaders. In past videos, I've talked about the end of the Calvin University circulatory system. This is part of this. A church in the Bay Area, here in the San Francisco Bay Area, how many ministers come from that Bay Area? Not a lot. How many ministers can afford to stay in that Bay Area? Not a lot. Usually what happens is that maybe these churches in the Bay Area will attract a candidate, but again, they're attracting a candidate. What does that mean? They might be a sharp young person. They might be a good preacher. They might be all of these things, but they basically go out to these hinterland churches as a starting church. Maybe the San Francisco Bay Area sounds like kind of an exciting place to minister for a little while. So they might go out there for 5, 10, 15 years. But if in fact they develop a bit of a reputation and some skills and all of that, they will likely be looking for a church back, so the saying goes, within 90 miles of their wife's, of their in-laws, and which means many of them go back to Western Michigan. There's a big pull for that. High concern about fit. Pastors are much more particularly about finding a perfect fit for their church, for their gifts. Churches are much more particular about finding just the right pastor. We have spent the past 30 years emphasizing the uniqueness of each pastor in each context. This means pastors and churches are not fungible commodities we treated them 30 years ago. When my grandfather was a minister, he moved usually every 4 to 6 years, and as the old saying go, you turn the sermon barrel over, which means that most Christian Reformed churches, they're all filled with Dutch immigrants of a certain era of immigration. Many of them are farmers. They're doing the same job, and ministers sort of circulate between them. One Christian Reformed church operates like the other. Since the 60s and 70s, big changes in that. It's no longer the case. Specialized roles. Interest in specialized roles in chaplaincy seems to be stronger in comparison to weakening interest in congregation. COVID drove a lot of ministers out of churches. And a lot of those ministers don't have a lot of good employment options. And chaplaincy or counseling is usually an attractive choice because you can work for the military, you can work for a hospital, you can work for a prison, some of these things. But now you're basically competing with all of the other religions and denominations in the country. The Human Sexuality Report, stress and uncertainty. These stressors in the system continue to play a role in discouraging leaders from entering ministry. So, the Association of Theological Schools in Pittsburgh, this is the accrediting agency for theological seminaries, the number of students enrolled in MDiv programs continues to decline across these seminaries that are credentialed, with a projected decline of 5% this year. So in other words, number of people going into seminary to get a Master's of Divinity is in decline overall. Talk about leadership development in classes. We had a leadership development training program that I ran with Kevin Adams back in when we're doing much more aggressive church planting. And so they've got a few programs to try and get these numbers up, but it's a tough thing to really impact. As I mentioned before, commissioned pastors are ministers that don't have a Master's of Divinity. At the time of this report, a denominational database showed that there were 90 commissioned pastors serving in a solo or lead role in a church. That's kind of supposed to be an exception, and it's 1/10 of the denomination. I suspect that number will grow as more and more churches become less viable. And again, if you've gone through all of the work to get a Master's of Divinity, and you've got a spouse and children in tow, which many of them have, you need to land in a place that is going to have housing and salary at a level where at least you can get a beginning if you're going to relocate. And what happens in many of these churches is they get a commissioned pastor, someone who is Reformed in one way or another, might not have much of any connection to the Christian Reformed Church. And again, this is part of the Christian Reformed Church basically becoming part of the larger church environment in North America. And 70 to 80% of these Christian Reformed churches, if not higher, will slowly become more and more vanilla evangelical or take on characteristics that are due to local culture. Aging is a very funny thing. You tend to have better awareness of the people who are older than you than younger than you. As I scroll through the delegates for Synod from 1999, I recognize more names than when I scroll through the delegates for Synod in 2024. I'll sometimes talk to my mother, who will often make similar observations today. So maybe that's enough for now. Yeah, let me know if you watched the video. Seems like, and if you want more information on the Christian Reformed Church Synod as things get closer. I should realize that some of you don't know how to give feedback. You can leave a comment in the comment section below. That'll do it. I read the comments.